This is the GH7. We're in Palermo to test it out. And I don't know about you, but I'm craving some gelato. There's a little horsey that's having like a bit of a tantrum. Are you done? Are you done? Are you done, sir? So let's talk top specs. The GH range, as we know, is a micro 4/3 range, and this camera is no different, so it means all of your lenses will fit the body. In terms of megapixels, it's 25.2. So for photography, you've got quite a lot to play with, but also for low light capability, this camera will perform incredibly well because of that sensor. And the AF is much improved for the GH range, and it comes from the S5 IIX. So if you're not familiar with that, it's a phase hybrid detect, which means that it's just a little bit more intuitive compared to the older Panasonic system if you're on a GH5. So the GH7 has the same sensor as the other two cameras in its range that you'll be used to, the GH5 and the GH6. So it's a live MOS sensor with a no low pass filter. In terms of IBIS, it has a 5-axis IBIS, so it's as good as the other two cameras, but with the much improved resolution that we'll talk about in a bit. So first we're going to head over and do some burst shutters so you can see how well it performs for photography. Have you subscribed yet? You should subscribe. We do a lot of good videos, I promise. So currently we're just testing out the burst mode. And one thing I've really liked about launches in the last year is that every camera now comes with like a pre-burst mode, which means that you take some shots sort of 1 second to 3 seconds before you actually started pressing the button. And that's great because I often miss, or I'm late, or we're running somewhere and I see the shot. So that's really fantastic. And this is performing really well in that setting. I've been able to get some really nice shots that I probably wouldn't have got if we didn't have that pre-burst mode setting. So what I've done is I've done some tests just with this beautiful arch in the back and some cyclists that have been coming through. So you've got electronic shutter, 20 frames per second, 60 frames per second, and 75 frames per second. Now on the screen, you can see the difference between those. What I like about that is you have more control over it. If you're shooting at the Olympics, maybe 75 frames per second is what you want, but it's a bit overkill if you're shooting like I am, horses and carriages and cyclists. So hopefully that gives you some idea of what you're capable of doing with this camera and the options that you have. Now, there is an adorable dog over there, so I'm going to go and pet it, and then we can carry on with our day. So you might be wondering why we're moving, and that's because we're on a horse and carriage, and we are on a horse and carriage to talk to you about autofocus, because what better test than when you're moving and nothing is in your control. Now let's talk about what this improvement really is, because in the GH6 we didn't yet have that improved autofocus system, which is hybrid phase detect. Previously, their autofocus is the one thing that in my opinion let Panasonic down, and now they've completely fixed it. On top of that, as with a lot of full frame cameras, you can now focus on body, eye, torso, so you have a lot more customizable options. And on top of that, they've announced that in firmware updates, they're going to continue to improve that AI-based autofocus system. So on the screen, you'll be seeing a few different tests from our filmmaker Luke, and he's going to show you how well it performs even when in motion. So we're back on solid ground, and I think Luke is about ready to see the back of that horse. Not literally, obviously, but they've also packed a lot more into this small body. And so in the GH6, we saw dual active IS2. We also saw 7.5 stops and 5-axis stabilization. We do have that in the GH7, but we also have active IS as well as dual active IS2 and electronic stabilization, which comes from the S5 IIX. So as you can see, they're putting quite a lot of attention into this. Now on the screen, you're going to see a bit of a silly test, but hopefully it will just show you a little bit about how that works. So let's take a closer look at those, because this is one of my favorite features of all Panasonic cameras. When you put on all of the combined stabilization, you get something that looks like you're shooting on a gimbal. So on the screen right now, you can see what it looks like with every setting turned off. Now on the screen, you can see what it looks like with electronic stabilization turned on. And now on the screen, you can see what it looks like when you turn on all of the stabilization options, including that dual active IS2. All of the footage shot that we've shown you today was whilst our filmmaker was running and I was running. So forgive having to see that. Nobody wants to see me exercise. So we're here in this really beautiful square. There was an opera singer just sort of performing, which is very Italian. I was taking a picture of the mountains in front of me, and it reminded me to talk to you about dynamic range, because whilst you have to compromise on the fact that this is a Micro Four Thirds camera, you don't have to compromise when it comes to performance. So just like the GH6, it has 13 plus stops of dynamic range, which means you can push it really far. We've been shooting in bright sunlight, so I'm going to show you a few pictures on the screen, which will show you how far you can push that. And now you're going to see some video on the screen where you can see that again. So as I say, I don't think you have to compromise. Even though it's very small, very lightweight, it still packs quite a punch. So let's crack on and see if we can find something to eat. Gotta get enough shots of Luke. See this ego. So we've already talked about the 25 megapixels, which for a camera built for video and low light is very good for stills. But I want to talk to you about resolution. So this little tiny camera might become part of your kit bag once you hear the amazing resolution that Panasonic have packed into the body. So we have 5.7K, 60p, 10-bit 422, and we have 5.8K, 30p, 10-bit 422. So that means you're getting a lot of the usual specs that we come to admire from Panasonic, but you're getting it in 5.7K. And it's open gate, which means that if you're shooting content creation and YouTube creation at the same time, as is our filmmaker, you can get both shots in one go. And of course, you've got 4K 120p, and whilst that's not open gate, it's wonderful to have the advantage of shooting in 4K to future-proof and being able to get super slow-mo. Now, if you're feeling really creative and you want to push it all the way up to 300 frames per second, which I cannot imagine you would, but if you did, it can do that in full HD in 420 as well. So basically, biggest specs I've ever seen for a Micro Four Thirds. Even I'm tempted, and I normally love a full frame. And finally, one of the most exciting things, which is going to be one hell of a mouthful for me, is that it shoots B-RAW, internal ProRes RAW, Apple ProRes RAW, and all of that comes at 29 frames per second, 24 frames per second, 25 frames per second, and 23.98 frames per second. So, options. Who needs them? It's kind of one thing I like about shooting with Micro Four Thirds is there are disadvantages, but the nice thing is that it's really light and their lenses are really light too. And so if you're doing something like this, you can kind of just shoot all day and not really feel it. It's quite interesting because it's not a photography first camera, and we all know that about the GH series cameras, but it's speedy. The 25 megapixels is plenty. And yeah, I mean, you couldn't ask for more from a hybrid, and I'm not even sure that they would call it a hybrid, but it is, yeah, the photo quality is just amazing. So with resolution, it doesn't end there, because if you're doing frame IO or proxy recording to an SSD, which you can do using a port in the camera in the GH7, you can shoot 4K 10-bit 422 up to 120 frames per second, which is pretty incredible when you think about the fact that you're recording to some sort of SSD device. On top of that, it has no limits when it comes to record time, and so you can record to your heart's content even if you're using internal ProRes. Now, usually we don't talk about audio because most people will be using external audio when it comes to their cameras. However, with the GH7, they've made some major improvements. So inside, we have a 32-bit float internal recording, which can be bettered when you're paired with an XLR adapter. Now, inside the box comes a converter cable, which is great because it means you don't have to make that extra purchase to shoot with XLR microphones. And with XLR microphones, you get the better audio recording. Now, that being said, what I really like about this camera is because of that 32-bit float, it means as a content creator, you can use the internal audio recording to make sure that people can hear your videos without having to buy those extra microphones that you often see on top of people's cameras. So I think that's a really great quality to have. You have the simple audio internal for those that are looking for more simplistic, all-in-one use. And then you've also got the ability to add XLR if you're more serious about your filmmaking journey and you want something that's a little more high level. So right now what you're hearing is the internal audio recording. So that's that 32-bit float that records internally to the camera on the GH7. We're going to talk about ISO, and usually when we talk about ISO, we talk about the bottom that it can go to and the higher end that it can go to, and then we talk about base ISO, and base is the optimal ISO that you should be shooting at to get the best from your camera. But with it being 25.2 megapixels, it should be really well capable of low light performance. So on the screen, you're going to see how well it performs in different scenarios, but right now we're going to talk about what the optimal ISO would be that you can push it to without getting grainy footage. So, over to Luke's channel.
So on this camera, you can have ISO boost. Now, if you're shooting in low light and you're using ISO, the ISO boost on would give you 250 to 12,800. With it off, it would give you 2,000 to 12,800. But being realistic, if you're not using one of the base levels that are optimized for low light shooting, I'm not going to want to push my ISO higher than 3,000 or 4,000. On the screen, you're going to see us pushing the ISO level as far as it'll go, so some of the footage might be a bit grainy. So having used it in low light, I've actually been really impressed with the ability that this camera has. Obviously, when you're using a camera that is a sensor with less megapixels, it means usually that it's much better in low light. So what you're losing in pixels is actually giving you better low light performance, which as a filmmaker is music to my ears.
So that concludes our time in Palermo with the GH7, and I've had a really great time using it. So let me talk to you about some of the things we haven't covered regarding the body. It's really lightweight, so it's very easy to carry around, and the lenses, as we expect from Lumix, are incredibly lightweight too. So if you're like me and you don't really like carrying around a lot of equipment, this is kind of the perfect setup for your run and gun shooting and your content creation, as well as for photographers, regardless of whether the GH7 series is really for photographers or not. In terms of where the buttons are, it's very intuitive. The menu system is so easy to use. You can find histograms, burst mode, and other settings within a few seconds, if not less. I really haven't had as much trouble getting to grips with this camera as I have with others that we've tested. And then in regards to where everything is, I quite like the placement of the buttons and the way that everything's been laid out. You've got your record up here, and you've got a lot of your white balance ISO and controls for that sort of setting at the top. The only thing I don't like is the play button. And it might just be me, and I might be really picky, but when I'm shooting, I often shoot one-handed, and I want to be able to see those pictures quite quickly, but the play button is actually all the way over here. So it does stop you from pressing it accidentally, but it is a little bit frustrating if you shoot the way that I shoot. When it comes to the screen, it's articulating, which is something we've come to love about the Panasonic range. But let's talk about usage, because usually when we go out and we shoot with these cameras, we list off the specs so that you can see what they are. But I want to talk to you a bit about performance. I think the Micro Four Thirds range gets a bit of a bad rep because full frame has become so popular these days. But the price is so affordable and the quality has been so good that I really don't think you're missing out. With 6K open gate, it also means that you can crop in a lot more, which you didn't have the ability to do before on this series of cameras. For me, the highlight of this camera though really comes down to the video and that stabilization mode. Having dual stabilization along with electronic stabilization, including the stabilization from the lens, means that you are shooting in what looks like you're using a gimbal on a camera that you can use handheld, and the amount of time and weight that saves is so incredible. But in my opinion, if this is what they can put out with their Micro Four Thirds range, I can't wait to see the developments from Panasonic that are coming in their full frame series cameras. I think this camera is a real testament to what Lumix and Panasonic have been working on, and I'm really excited to see what comes next. So keep an eye on our channel to find out more.